In the forgotten corners of America's past, there are families whose names are spoken only in whispers. Their stories were buried under rotting floorboards, sealed inside abandoned farmhouses, and erased from the town records. But the land never forgets. And once in a while, one of these stories claws its way back to the surface, cold, twisted, and hungry for the truth to be told. The Vancroft farmstead sat like a rotting tooth in the middle of the Ozark wilderness, miles beyond where any sensible traveler would wander, surrounded by a thickness of trees that swallowed sound and refused to let go of daylight. For years, locals claimed the land itself felt older than anything around it, as if the soil remembered things people tried desperately to forget. The path leading to the property was little more than a narrow trail carved by wagon wheels long abandoned, and even the bravest hunters avoided it, swearing they heard things moving in the brush that did not belong to any ordinary creature. The isolation wasn't just physical, it felt intentional, as though something on that land wanted to be left undisturbed, while simultaneously pulling curious eyes toward it like a cold breath on the back of the neck. The Vancroft family rarely appeared in town, and when they did, their presence created a ripple through the air. Neighbors spoke about the father, Elias Vancroft, with hushed tones, noting the way his eyes never seemed to blink and how he kept one hand gripped tightly on the back of his daughter's shoulders, guiding them as though they might run if given even a second of freedom. The sisters looked pale, thinner each time they appeared, their dresses too big on their frames, their steps hesitant like they were learning to walk again after a long confinement. People said Elias didn't allow visitors to his land, and that the last person who attempted to help the family suddenly left town without explanation, abandoning his home and belongings, moving west with such haste that even his closest friends never heard from him again. Screams were reported echoing through the dense trees, though anyone who followed the sound found only silence and the unsettling realization that the forest seemed to close in behind them. Some residents insisted it was just the wind twisting through broken branches, but others, especially older hunters, swore they recognized the tone of human fear carried across the night air. They claimed the sound rose sharply, like someone begging for mercy or calling for help, then was cut off abruptly, as if swallowed by something lurking between the shadows of the tree line. The sheriff visited the Vancroft property twice, once after rumors of strange lights flickering in the barn, and once after someone claimed to see the sisters running toward the riverbank with torn clothing and dirt smeared across their faces. Both times he returned tight-lipped, refusing to discuss what he saw, insisting the town let the matter rest. The farmstead itself rotted piece by piece, its walls sagging inward, shingles slipping like loose teeth ready to fall. Crows nested in the rafters, circling the sky overhead in ominous patterns no one could explain. Residents whispered that the birds behaved strangely around the Vancroft land, gathering in unnatural numbers, quiet as if listening for something beneath the earth. Even animals that should have thrived in the Ozarks, wolves, deer, foxes, avoided the boundaries of the property, leaving the area eerily devoid of natural sound. It was said that at night you could stand at the edge of the woods and feel the land breathe, feel a coldness rolling across the ground, heavy enough to seep into your bones. Then, without warning, the Vancroft family stopped coming into town altogether. Weeks passed, then months, and no one caught so much as a glimpse of them. The postmaster noticed mail piling up, packages unclaimed, and townsfolk began to speculate whether illness had overtaken the secluded household. Some suspected the father had grown even more unhinged, tightening his grip on the girls in ways no one wanted to imagine. Others whispered darker theories that the girls had finally escaped into the night, leaving behind whatever terror had kept them captive for so long. As the absence stretched on, people who lived closest to the woods reported seeing lantern light drifting through the trees, moving slowly as though carried by someone unfamiliar with the path yet determined to keep walking. A few claimed they saw shadows slipping between the trunks, slim figures with long hair, moving silently, glancing back over their shoulders as if something pursued them. Those who witnessed these apparitions refused to investigate, afraid that whatever they found might follow them home. Eventually, suspicion outweighed fear, and a small group of men from town decided to check on the family. They ventured only halfway down the overgrown trail before turning back, shaken by the overwhelming sense that they were being watched by unseen eyes. One man claimed he saw a figure standing in the farmhouse window, staring out with an expression that didn't look entirely human. He wouldn't describe what he meant by that, and he refused to go near the woods ever again. Rumors swirled, each more unsettling than the last, feeding into the town's growing obsession with what might be happening on that cursed land. And as more people admitted to hearing muffled cries drifting on the wind, the story became impossible to ignore. Something was deeply wrong on the Vancroft farmstead, something that had been building for years in that isolated pocket of forest where only the trees bore witness to the family's slow, silent disappearance from the world, leaving behind a tightening darkness that crept closer each night, as if trying to reach any living soul who dared to listen for what waited in the shadows of the Vancroft land without anyone realizing what had already begun. Elias Vancroft had always been a stern man, but those who had known him before the winter of 1898 claimed he was at least predictable, hard-working, and devoted to maintaining the rough little farmstead deep in the Ozark woods. Something changed in him after the fever that nearly killed him. It struck during the coldest month, a sickness that left him bedridden for days, drifting in and out of delirium, muttering to things no one else could see. When the fever finally broke, the doctor left believing Elias had survived by sheer force of will, but the man who stood up from that bed was not the same one who had laid down in it. His eyes seemed darker, sunken, shifting too quickly, as if he was trying to watch every corner of the room at once. Neighbors said he began speaking in low, hurried tones, sounding as though he were answering questions no one had asked aloud. The illness left him with a shaking in his hands, and instead of resting, he became obsessed with controlling every aspect of the household. Work that once took his daughters hours now had to be completed in minutes, and if the slightest task fell short, Elias reacted with a rage people described as unnatural, a violent snap from a man who had never before raised his voice in public. The girls, who once appeared timid but harmlessly quiet, now flinched at the smallest movement, their eyes darting toward their father, as though anticipating a threat. They rarely spoke, and when they did, their voices came out hushed and quivering, like they were afraid of being overheard by something lurking just behind them. He boarded up the windows of the house while claiming he wanted to keep out the cold, yet he did it in midsummer when the heat suffocated the woods. He hammered thick planks over every opening, leaving only slivers of light to cut across the dim, suffocating rooms. Even the front door received an extra lock, then another, until the entire house took on the appearance of a place meant not just to keep something out, but to trap something inside. Neighbors noticed the smoke from the chimney had changed, turning blacker, thicker, almost oily, drifting through the air with a smell sharp enough to sting the nose. When asked about it, Elias muttered that it was just his new kind of firewood and refused to explain further. The fever had left him paranoid. He whispered that the world outside was dangerous, that people in town were watching them, that the forest creatures lurked too close to the windows at night. He kept the daughters indoors for days without letting them step outside, and when they finally did appear in the yard, they moved stiffly, as if they'd forgotten what sunlight felt like on their skin. Some townsfolk claimed they saw the girls kneeling in the field long after dusk, collecting stones into piles and arranging them in circles that meant nothing to anyone except perhaps to their father, who watched from the porch with a strange, hungry intensity. The sisters were sent into town less frequently, and when they came, they carried lists of supplies that made no sense. Large quantities of salt, thick rope, candles by the dozens, heavy nails, and jars of lye. They spoke as little as possible, only whispering the necessities, and kept their hands folded tightly in front of them like they were practicing obedience. People noticed bruises in the shapes of fingers along their arms, faint but undeniable. When someone tried to ask them if they needed help, the girls stiffened, shaking their heads with forced smiles before glancing toward the woods, as if they believed their father could see them from miles away. The worst change came at night. Elias began digging behind the barn, long, narrow trenches he worked on until dawn, throwing dirt aside with a desperation that frightened those who happened upon the property by accident. He said he was preparing to plant something, yet no seeds were ever sown, and nothing grew there except cold pockets of air that lingered long after the trenches were filled again. People spoke of hearing Elias talking to the soil, murmuring in a tongue that didn't resemble English or any dialect spoken in the area. They said the ground around those dug-up places felt warmer than it should, as if something beneath it was alive. Inside the house, he forbid lamps after sundown and insisted everyone lived by candlelight. The daughters walked from room to room carrying trembling flames, eyes darting to corners where the shadows seemed to writhe. Elias claimed the darkness revealed things the light didn't, and he demanded the girls listen for sounds he believed came from inside the walls. He became convinced that their home sat on cursed land, and that only he understood the warnings whispered in his fevered dreams. The illness had not only twisted his mind, but seemed to have convinced him that he alone could command whatever presence he imagined lingered around them. He started carving symbols into the wooden beams of the house, scratching rough shapes along the door frames and window ledges with a rusted knife. When the daughters asked why he did it, he told them it was protection, that the woods were listening, that the land itself wanted something from them. The symbols spread, becoming more elaborate, more frenzied, covering walls, floors, even the underside of the bed frames. Some looked like crude attempts at letters, others like twisted figures reaching toward one another, and still others seemed to resemble eyes carved in uneven clusters that watched whoever passed them. The girls were not spared from his growing madness. He woke them at all hours of the night, claiming he heard footsteps outside, insisting they stand with him in silence as he waited for something to approach. Some nights he forced them to kneel in the center of the room while he circled them slowly, muttering about loyalty and trust and the dangers of betrayal. Other nights he locked them in their rooms, pacing the hallway, muttering threats to unseen foes, stopping only to press his ear against the walls as though expecting whispers to answer him back. Over time, whatever was left of the man he once was seemed to erode, leaving behind a hollow figure driven only by fear, authority, and an obsession deeper than anyone could understand, an obsession that tightened around the house like a tightening rope, pulling the sisters into a darkness they never asked to enter, a darkness Elias believed was the only way to keep them close, no matter what the world outside tried to take from him. The first signs that something was deeply wrong with the Vancroft sisters began as small, unsettling shifts, barely noticeable to anyone who didn't know them. But in a place as quiet and watchful as the Ozarks, even the smallest irregularity carried weight. At first, it was just the way the sisters moved, too synchronized for comfort, as though one shadow mirrored the other with unnatural precision. They had always been quiet girls, shy and withdrawn, but after Elias's illness their silence grew heavy, shaped by fear and routines no one outside their home could understand. Those who saw them remarked on how they walked with their shoulders curled forward, eyes fixed on the ground, as if afraid to meet anyone's gaze or show even a spark of independent thought. Their breaths came too softly, too controlled, like they were practiced in making themselves small enough to be overlooked. Over time, their strange behaviors became impossible to ignore. When they did come into town, they no longer walked side by side but in a restless formation, one slightly ahead of the other, glancing back every few steps as though checking for pursuit. Their clothes appeared rumpled and mismatched, sometimes buttoned incorrectly or stained with dirt and wax, as though they dressed in the dark or were forced into their garments by hurried hands. Once, the younger sister arrived without shoes, her feet raw and scraped, leaving faint smears of blood on the wooden floors of the general store. When someone asked her what had happened, she gave a weak smile and said she simply forgot them. But the way her voice cracked and her eyes darted to the doorway made it clear the truth was far more disturbing. People began noticing that the sisters often carried slips of paper, folded tightly and clutched in trembling fingers. They hid these papers the moment anyone approached, tucking them under sleeves or slipping them into pockets with unnatural haste. A shopkeeper once caught a glimpse of one before it disappeared. Strange symbols scrawled in charcoal, uneven lines circling a crude drawing of an eye. When asked about it, neither sister spoke. They only exchanged a panicked look, as though the marks on the page held a secret that must never be revealed, not even accidentally. Some claimed these drawings were messages, silent pleas for help disguised as childish scribbles. Others whispered they were instructions, commands etched into their minds by a father sinking deeper into madness. Their behavior grew even more alarming when they were seen wandering the woods near dusk. Despite being forbidden from leaving the farm, the girls slipped into the trees barefoot, their hair tangled, moving with a dreamlike slowness toward the riverbank. Witnesses described them pacing in circles, tracing shapes in the dirt with their fingers, sometimes kneeling to press their hands flat against the ground as if listening for vibrations beneath the soil. Their whispers carried on the wind, soft and hurried, like prayers spoken to something hidden in the dark. When approached, they fled, vanishing between the trees with startling speed, appearing more like frightened animals than children desperate for freedom. In the few moments when someone managed to speak to them directly, the girls seemed to exist halfway between panic and obedience. They startled at simple gestures, flinching when a hand rose to wave or when someone stepped too close. The older sister often covered her mouth with both hands when someone addressed her, as if afraid words might escape without permission. The younger one constantly rubbed at her wrists, red marks encircling them like she had recently been bound or tightly gripped. Their eyes, once bright with the usual curiosity of youth, now held a glassy sheen, reflecting a kind of silent suffering that made others uneasy, as though they carried secrets too heavy for them to bear. Then came the nights when the sisters were seen standing at the edge of the forest, completely still, watching the town from afar. They remained unmoving for long stretches of time, silhouettes framed by moonlight, hands clasped tightly together. Some said they could hear the girls humming, a single trembling note that wavered through the darkness and set dogs barking across the valley. Others swore the sisters weren't watching the town at all, but something behind it, their heads tilting as though listening to distant footsteps approaching from the hills. No one dared get close enough to confirm which was true. Their strange behavior didn't stop there. On one rainy afternoon, a farmer's wife found the sisters crouched beside her barn, collecting dead birds into a neat row on the ground. Their faces were blank, their movements methodical, placing each bird with careful precision before stepping back to examine their work. When the woman asked what they were doing, they only said they needed to finish what was started, offering no explanation before running off into the storm. The sight of them, dripping wet, trembling, eyes wide with a mixture of terror and determination, haunted the woman for years. The girls also started appearing in places they had no reason to be. Once they were seen near the old cemetery at dusk, arranging stones into spiraling patterns, their dresses dragging over the graves. Another time they were spotted behind the church, scratching marks into the wall with broken pieces of bone. Every encounter left people feeling they had witnessed something private and chilling, as if the sisters were rehearsing rituals forced upon them by their father or by whatever twisted beliefs had taken root in the Vancroft home after his illness. Their voices changed, too. They rarely spoke to townsfolk, but when they spoke to each other, it was in hurried fragments, half-phrases that made no sense to anyone listening. Sometimes the older sister repeated Elias's words, mimicking his tone so precisely it startled those nearby. Other times, the younger girl whispered apologies to no one in particular, tears streaking her cheeks even when nothing visibly prompted them. The fear embedded in their every movement convinced the town that the girls were trapped in a nightmare that had become their daily existence, shaped by forces they were too young to understand and too terrified to escape. And as their behavior grew more frantic and unpredictable, the line between superstition, madness, and reality blurred for everyone who crossed their path, leaving behind a lingering dread that something unnatural was unfolding on the Vancroft land, and that the sisters, fragile and hollow-eyed, were caught in the middle of it without any hope of deliverance. The night the doors were barred arrived with a storm that seemed to have been summoned specifically for the Vancroft farmstead, rolling across the Ozark hills with thunder that rattled windows and wind that bent the trees like they were made of paper. No one in the nearby town remembered a night so dark, so thick with the kind of air that made the skin crawl and the stomach tighten. The rain began in sheets, falling in relentless torrents that turned the dirt paths into streams, washing away footprints, as though the land itself wanted to hide the events of that night. Lightning split the sky again and again, illuminating the farmhouse for brief moments, revealing the silhouette of Elias pacing the porch, arms raised toward the sky, the outlines of the girls standing silently behind him, their forms rigid and tense. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls, dancing in rhythm with the storm, as if the house itself had become alive and aware of the chaos outside. Inside, the Vancroft home was a different world entirely. Candles flickered along the hallways, their light weak against the oppressive darkness that pressed through the cracks in the boarded windows. The air smelled sharp and acrid, a mixture of damp wood, smoke, and something else that no one could name, but that left a bitter taste at the back of the throat. The girls moved from room to room under the guidance of their father, carrying supplies and following precise instructions without hesitation, their movements deliberate, rehearsed, almost ritualistic. They avoided eye contact with each other, their heads bowed, hands tightly folded, trembling slightly with the effort of restraint. Elias circled them, muttering in a low, urgent voice, half prayers and half instructions, as if the storm itself demanded obedience, and he alone had the authority to answer. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, bending branches until they scraped against the walls of the house like skeletal fingers. The rain pelted the roof and splintered against the boards, creating a sound that was equal parts hammering and wailing. Occasionally, a door slammed on its own, and the girls flinched as if the house itself were speaking, warning them, judging them. Elias's shadow stretched across the floor with every flash of lightning, looming impossibly tall, as if the man had become something more than human, a figure of wrath and obsession made flesh, embodying the storm's fury within his own twisted form. Those who dared to observe from the woods claimed they could see lanterns moving behind the boards, flashes of yellow light that shifted from window to window, never staying in one place for long. The light moved like hands searching for something lost in the dark, and the trees around the property seemed to shiver in response, swaying with a life of their own. The cries of the storm mixed with faint sounds that could have been whispers, half heard and half imagined, creating a cacophony that made even the most skeptical townsfolk shiver. There were those who insisted they saw figures at the windows, faces pressed against the boards, eyes wide and fearful, only to vanish the instant anyone tried to get closer. The storm had become a perfect cover for something far older and far more malignant than mere wind and rain. Inside, the girls were forced to participate in tasks that seemed endless. Elias demanded they clean the floors repeatedly, scrubbing in patterns dictated by him, moving in circles that mirrored the shapes carved into the walls. Each time they finished, he inspected their work, his gaze sharp and merciless, returning them to start over if a line was even slightly crooked. The candlelight caught the sweat on their skin, the tremble of their hands, and the deepening hollow under their eyes. The storm raged louder outside, but inside, an even more insistent, unrelenting pressure pressed down, a weight born of fear, obedience, and the father's growing madness. The night stretched unnaturally long. Minutes felt like hours, and hours bled into one another in a monotony broken only by Elias's sudden outbursts and the occasional flash of lightning that revealed the trembling figures of the girls in stark relief. Sometimes they stopped moving, staring at corners of the room where nothing seemed to exist, listening intently to sounds no one else could hear. Some townsfolk who watched from the forest edge swore they saw shadows separating from the girls, writhing along the walls before vanishing, leaving the sisters alone again with the oppressive weight of the house. Each time, Elias's mutterings grew more frantic, more desperate, as if he were communicating with some unseen force demanding their compliance, and as if failure would result in consequences beyond human understanding. The storm seemed to respond to the household's tension, the wind bending branches toward the windows with uncanny accuracy, rain splashing up against the boards as though tapping to announce its presence, a spectator in a scene that was both alive and malevolent. Each flash of lightning exposed more than the house. It exposed the growing terror in the sisters' eyes, the tightness in their posture, and the flickers of something hidden deep within them. A fear of more than punishment, a recognition of forces they could neither name nor resist. The storm and the house seemed to merge into one entity, one enormous breathing presence, and the girls' movements became part of its rhythm, dictated by commands and rituals that no outsider could fully comprehend. As the night pressed on, even the few brave men who had ventured near the property to check on the family could sense the unnatural weight of what they observed. The house emitted a low, almost imperceptible hum that set their teeth on edge, the kind of sound that resonated deep within the chest, the sound of a place that knew secrets and would not release them. Lanterns flickered across the boards from inside, and fleeting shadows moved behind the slats, forming shapes that defied explanation, as if the storm outside had seeped into the walls themselves. Every crack of thunder seemed to punctuate Elias's furious instructions, driving the sisters harder, faster, deeper into the routines he demanded. By the time the town awoke the next day, the storm had passed, leaving the trail to the Vancroft farmstead muddied and treacherous. No one could see clearly what had transpired inside, and the few who dared peer from a distance reported only that the house appeared darker somehow, heavier, more complete in its silence than it had been before. The girls were not seen in town for days afterward, and even Elias's brief excursions seemed haunted, his movements jerky and deliberate, as though he had been touched by something beyond the ordinary. The people whispered to each other in hushed tones about the night, piecing together what little they had seen and filling in the blanks with imaginations sharpened by fear. Something extraordinary, horrifying, and inexplicable had occurred behind those barred doors, and it left a mark on the land, and on those who observed it, that would linger far longer than the memory of any storm could fade. When authorities finally made their way into the Vancroft farmhouse, the scene that greeted them was one of unsettling silence and a darkness that seemed to cling to every corner. The house, long abandoned by any visitor from town, had fallen into a state of decay so complete that even the air inside felt thick, almost tangible, pressing down on anyone who dared to step over the threshold. Floorboards sagged and groaned underfoot, releasing clouds of dust that had settled over years of isolation, and the walls, scarred and blackened, were etched with patterns that defied reason, some carved deep enough to catch shadows in the flickering light of lanterns. The authorities moved cautiously, aware that the building itself seemed to resist intrusion, as though it had become a vessel for the fear and obsession that had consumed the Vancroft family for so long. The first room they entered was what had once been the living area, now transformed into a labyrinth of strange symbols scratched into every available surface. Some shapes were geometric, crude triangles and circles overlapping in haphazard symmetry. Others resembled distorted faces or eyes staring out from the wood as if observing the intruders. The air smelled faintly of smoke, rotting wood, and something organic that could not be identified. It clung to their nostrils in a way that made the stomach churn, and it seemed as if the house itself exhaled a slow, deliberate warning. Authorities noted that no ordinary human could have maintained such carvings in secrecy. The patterns were too precise in places, repeated with a compulsive regularity that suggested obsession bordering on mania. Moving deeper into the house, they came across rooms that had been converted into spaces of ritualistic preparation. Heavy chains and ropes were scattered across the floors, alongside overturned chairs and broken furniture. Candles, some melted down to stubs and others still partially intact, were arranged in circles, their wax hardened into shapes that looked almost like bones under the dim light. The investigators found scraps of paper covered in frantic writing that was indecipherable at first, but on closer inspection revealed sketches and words that hinted at instructions, lists, and warnings. Each scrap seemed to tell a story of obedience, fear, and compulsion, a map of the daughter's daily existence under the father's control. The air here was heavier still, and even those hardened men admitted they felt an almost tangible sense of dread, like the house had absorbed the family's terror and kept it locked inside the walls. The bedrooms offered the most chilling discoveries. The sisters' personal spaces were barren, stripped of anything that could suggest comfort or individuality. Mattresses were pressed flat, torn in places, and the few belongings they had been allowed were scattered or hidden behind panels in the floor. Beneath these panels, investigators discovered journals, written in tiny, careful handwriting that chronicled not only daily tasks and the father's instructions, but also the girl's inner fears and observations of the world outside. Some pages contained frantic drawings of shadows that seemed to move on their own, and repeated references to voices from the walls, whispers that instructed them, warned them, or punished them in their father's absence. The journals made it clear that the sisters had been subjected to a psychological environment so oppressive that reality and imagination had begun to merge, leaving them trapped in a waking nightmare for years. In the basement, the authorities found remnants of Elias's obsession manifested in ways that suggested both paranoia and ritual. Trenches and pits that had been dug were still partially filled with dirt, their edges uneven, as if the work had been interrupted suddenly. At the bottom of some of these shallow excavations were small, indistinct objects wrapped in fabric and buried beneath layers of earth. It was unclear whether these were offerings, protective measures, or simply the manifestations of a mind consumed by fear. The walls were also covered in markings similar to those upstairs, but here they were accompanied by scratches deep enough to draw blood from anyone who brushed against them. It was as though the house had been transformed into a vast living diary of obsession and control, with every corner, floorboard, and wall bearing witness to the father's mania and the daughter's enforced participation. The attic, often overlooked, revealed the final layer of horror in the house. There, rafters were lined with crude effigies, some resembling figures of the sisters themselves, others impossible to identify but grotesque in form. Each effigy was pinned in place with nails, dressed in scraps of fabric, or surrounded by symbols carved into the beams above. Some had faded candle wax dripping over them, hardened into shapes that resembled runes or sigils. Investigators speculated that the attic had been the center of Elias's most private rituals, a space where he could enforce his authority in complete isolation and where the girls were forced to witness or participate in acts that were beyond comprehension. The lingering smell of smoke, wax and decay created an atmosphere so oppressive that the officers had to step outside repeatedly to avoid the claustrophobia that threatened to overwhelm them. Every discovery in the house suggested a family consumed by fear, obsession, and ritualistic compulsion, a household where control had been absolute and terror had been normalized. Objects, carvings, and hidden notes all pointed to a long, systematic imposition of dominance, creating a physical and psychological environment that left the sisters as much prisoners of their own home as of their father. Each room, corner, and hidden panel acted as a testament to the father's descent into mania and the daughter's enforced compliance, leaving an imprint that would remain long after the house itself began to crumble. The investigators, though experienced in cases of domestic violence, criminal neglect, and even occult superstition, admitted that nothing in their prior experience prepared them for the oppressive, meticulous horror that permeated the Vancroft farmhouse, a place where history, madness, and human cruelty had intertwined into a palpable presence that refused to dissipate.